This evening is the sixth in the Fall Faculty Lecture series, this series being called The African Drama, The Building of Nations. This evening's lecturer is Professor Biebuyck, Professor of Anthropology at UCLA. Professor Biebuyck is a native of Belgium who spent many years in Africa from 1949 to 1961. He is a former professor at the University of London. Formerly was the H. Rodney Sharp Professor of Anthropology at the University of Delaware, and the Committee on Public Lectures is very honored that he would speak to us tonight, especially in the sense that this is his first semester at UCLA and he would join us in the series so soon. He's the author and co-author of several books, many books that deal with Africa, and during his field research in Africa has amassed quite a collection of African art, some of which you will see this evening. The title of his lecture this evening is African Art, Its Cultural Bases. And it is one other thing I should mention. We usually indulge ourselves in something of a question and answer period following the lecture. We'll do so. We usually close about 9:30 or so. It's with great pleasure that I present to you Professor Daniel Biebuyck.
Yeah, it's quite an involved affair. Can you perhaps fix it? So, I have all the necessary paraphernalia, which I hate, and I can now start this lecture, I hope. Our documentation about Africa is often considerable on the surface, but in reality it is mostly very shallow. This critical note is particularly relevant when we embark on the venture of unraveling what we have somewhat pompously called the cultural basis of the African arts. Possibly no sphere of African activity has been less adequately treated in field studies or writing, although the quantity of florilegiums of oral literature or of personal anthologies of African sculpture often seems considerable. There is, for instance, little orderly descriptive knowledge available on particular tribal literatures or on specific tribal sculptural traditions. Many publications on African traditional literature present loose translations or abstracts of stories, but they omit the vernacular text along with the notes on the cultural context and the specific stylistic features. As to most publications on African sculpture, they restrict themselves to a selection of photographs of allegedly representative carvings and to some classification, stylistic analysis, historical speculation, and some other conventional stereotypes about the meaning of that art. Patient, atomistic, close analysis of each art has all too rarely been made. And furthermore, there is no generally valid theoretical framework available, say for the study of African oral literature or for African sculpture. A great many factors would account for this situation. The adequate study of African art forms, which has in the first place to be made in the field and not in the museum or in the library, requires patient and prolonged field study, considerable linguistic skill, thorough knowledge of the culture at large. It is further hampered by the considerable degree of reticence that many Africans have shown when it comes to interpreting their art and also by the absence on the part of the Africans of any coherent theoretical speculation about their art. Moreover, although linguistic and anthropological studies in Africa have been well developed over the last 30 or 40 years, it would seem that linguists have been more interested in structural grammar and classification of language than in the collection of texts, thus leaving the task to missionaries, interested officials, early ethnographers, and a very few anthropologists in the modern sense. Anthropologists on the whole largely neglected the humanistic aspects of African life, leaving, for instance, the task of studying African plastic art to museologists, aestheticians, artists, who found a ready source for speculation in the thousands of items accumulated in museums and private collections. Recently, some kind of timid reaction developed against this situation, as is revealed, for instance, in the newly established Oxford Library of African Literature, or the preparation by the International African Institute of a bibliography on the African arts, or the activities of the African Studies Association's Committee on Fine Arts and the Humanities, or finally the preparation by UNESCO of an anthology on African literature. But judging from grants given in 1964 by some of the major research institutions sponsoring work on Africa, or judging also from the external research reports about studies in progress on Africa, the focus is still overwhelmingly, if not entirely, on economics, politics, educational problems, linguistic study, and social anthropology. Yet, as you all know, the pre-colonial peoples of Africa have manifested a high level of skill, creativity, and inventiveness in the fields of music, dance, literature, drama, plastic and graphic arts, even architecture. In the minds of many of us, rhythm and dance are inseparable from our African image, or the one we have made for ourselves about Africa. There is a great wealth of musical styles and manners of performance with ample aesthetic and structural proficiency, ranging from the great xylophone bands of the Chopi to the royal drummers of Rwanda, or the simplest fragments of melody on pygmy musical bows. In tens of thousands of aphorisms, riddles, tales, myths, prayers, formulae, epics of considerable stylistic interest, Africans have expressed their knowledge, wit, ethical concepts, their ideas about the legal, the political, the social, the religious, and the educational. The entire païdema of the Lega in the Congo is expressed in proverbs. The Dogon of Mali or the Chokwe of the Congo have condensed their cosmological beliefs in elaborate myths, which are also represented in masks, statues, decorative designs. The Mongo or the Bakongo of the Congo cannot conceive of a court case where ideas would not be clarified and tensions soothed by the recitation of proverbs or tales. The Chaga teach their very young children about the sanctions against misbehavior in stories about monsters. When those children grow up, values of filial piety and diligence, sanctions against laziness and rebelliousness are taught them in moral tales and riddles. at the age of 14, all that is replaced by proverbs, which are used by parents and in initiation ceremonies as didactic devices. Much of this literature is sung and danced, acted out in dramatic performances, or closely connected with plastic and graphic art. Its imagery is conceived in terms of the life of the people and of nature. Its metaphors are taken from a wide variety of activities, not the least the hunting and collective activities. They are the subject of multifarious interpretations, traditional or applied to the specific acculturative situations. More than anything else, I would say, the study of this literature opens wide horizons for theoretical advances on the nature of African culture or African systems of thought. Painting and drawing represent an ancient activity in Africa, as is revealed in the famous Bushman drawings or the cave paintings of the Bauchi plateaus in Nigeria, or the rock paintings of the Margi in Nigeria, or of the Dogon in Mali, or of the Mayumbe in the Congo. Africans have not only been decorating their bodies with paint or their masks or statues or other religious objects, they have done that very much, but their houses and the shrines for the spirits as well. Geometric paintings on houses, done exclusively by women, are found in widely scattered areas throughout sub-Saharan Africa. And so are figure paintings done by men exclusively on shrines or chiefs' houses. The content of these drawings and paintings is mythical or religious, but some graphically represent the content of tales and riddles, and still others depict scenes of everyday life. Again, many of them serve as didactic devices, like, for instance, the paintings made on the walls of the huts, the Ntanda huts, by Sukuma snake charmers in the Buyeye society of Tanganyika, which serve to impart on the initiates a complete knowledge of snakes, their various species, the methods of catching them, and the cures for snake bites, of course. The colors themselves, although very few in Africa, black, white, red, some green and blue, have great symbolic meaning, for instance, in the marriage ceremonies, in the exchange processes, in divination, in sacrifice, in initiations. But few studies have been made on this most fascinating of all African activities. But the most popular, I would say, and as far as the West is concerned, at least, the most coveted of African arts are the carvings and castings of masks and statues. No African artistic activity has been more lavishly illustrated in writings and photography. None has been more readily and easily accessible, since private collections and the museums of the Western world hold them by the tens of thousands. No form of artistic activity has been the object of greater speculation and nonsensical conjectures. We have time to recall here we have no time, I will say, to recall here the particular circumstances in which these carvings were brought to our attention early in the 20th century, at a time when everybody in the West had his own dreams about African savagery and darkness. But it is necessary to remember that by the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, thousands of sculptured items had been pouring into the Western private collections and museums, and these objects had of course been acquired in the most obscure ways, torn away from their social settings and cultural contexts, whereas the collectors of those items either knew nothing about them or had only false information about their use and meaning. Museologists set immediately out to describe and classify. That's their job. Artists like de Vlaminck, Matisse, Derain, Vollard, Braque, Picasso, Kandinsky, Marc became all of us rapidly fervent visitors of the British Museum and the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, and by 1908 many of those artists had acquired some African masks and statues, which were to revolutionize some of the Western stylistic currents. The stage was set for an all-out assault by museologists, aestheticians, artists, dealers on the classification, description, and interpretation of that sculpture. Given the total unfamiliarity with the specific content of this art, given the lack of adequate documentation, and the simple fact also that the collected object was mostly the only link that stood between Africa and the Western interpreter, a series of general assumptions were made. The African artist, it was said, was trying to express the same kind of things that Western artists tried to say. The African art was essentially symbolic, and the symbolic conventions used by the African artists were the same as those found in Western tradition. The African arts, it was said, were conceptually separable or separated. And finally, the meaning and usage of these sculptures was said to be rigid and stereotyped. Thus, some of the major slogans about African sculpture rapidly developed. The art was fetishistic and animistic. The content was repellent. Terror, cruelty, pathetic acceptance of the unknown was expressed in that art. The spirit reflected was, as one critic said, that of a trapped animal trying to escape by means of magic. The art was tribalistic and collective, anonymous, and rigidly adhered to fixed tradition. These slogans, and many others, which unfortunately have survived until now, plus our intrinsic cult for age, patination, purity, plus the neglect to look for the artist and the audience who produce this art and for whom the art is displayed or made, have very much obscured our understanding of the fundamental meanings of African sculpture. As an example, I would like to discuss somewhat in greater detail certain aspects of African sculpture and its meaning. Let me first point out that verbal concepts for sculpture, mask, statue, are mostly absent from the African vocabulary. The carving of masks or statues is conceived not as a special category of activities, but as part of a general set of activities of working in wood. Ibaza, the verb that refers to carve among the Balega of the Congo, refers to the act of producing a handle for a knife, or a shaft for a spear, or the act of producing a drum, or one of the marvelous ivory statues. The Bapende in the Western Congo, who are famous for their outstanding masks, this is an example about which I will say something later on. These Bapende have no general term for mask, but they distinguish three functionally different categories of masks. The large woven ones, woven in raffia fiber, are minganji, and they have specific functions. The wooden masks of that type are the mbuya, and the very little masks made in ivory or in bone or in safu seeds or in a variety of other materials which are to be worn around the neck are ikoko. There are 3 words for mask, not 1. There is not a generic concept for mask as such. And the same is true for the Balega peoples, among whom I did my second field work in 1954-55. Among them, there are essentially 3 types of masks. Little masks, they may be a little bit larger than that, in elephant, bone, or in ivory, which are lukungu, skulls. Beautifully carved wooden masks, generally small in size, which are lukwa Congo, das, gathers in. And thirdly, larger mask. Unfortunately, I have not a better example. It should be larger. This is a not very representative example, which are idimu, monsters. So there is, among these Africans, as far as their verbal categories go, no clear-cut separation between, for instance, the utilitarian and the stylistic aspects or the artistic activity. When it comes to defining categories among them, the functional aspects are essential, eventually intermingled with some stylistic features, the size of the objects, and particularly the materials in which they are made. Furthermore, these masks very often have no meaning in themselves. They have to be seen, as people in Africa see them, with the attachment of costumes accompanied by dances, by music, by specific songs. A mask like this one, for instance, which generally it is said by observers has a serene face, can, according to the costumes that are attached to it and to the kind of objects that the dancer wears in his hand when carrying the mask, express either the chief, Mfumu, or Putu, the great killer. There's quite some difference between that, and it is astonishing for us probably that a great killer is represented stylistically at least with a kind of serene, smiling face, and that it can express these 2 ideas. So it is the whole context, the songs, the dance, the costume, the various other paraphernalia, objects held in the hand and so on, which give meaning to these pieces, whereas very often in themselves their meanings are multivalent. The carving or casting of masks now and of statues in Africa is essentially restricted to 3 broadly defined areas. The Western Sudan, let's say ranging from Mali into parts of northern Guinea and the northern area of Ivory Coast and Upper Volta, the Guinea coast, which extends into parts of Nigeria here, and largely defined the Congo area, which includes large parts of the former Belgian Congo, French Congo, the Gabon, and the Cameroons. So the sculpture of masks and statues is restricted to a well-defined area in Africa, whereas, of course, music or literature or also dance is a universal phenomenon. Outside the 3 areas which I have just defined, there are a few scattered groups that occasionally have produced some carvings, such as the Makonde in Tanganyika, or the Shona in southern Rhodesia, or the Lozi in northern Rhodesia. On the other hand, there is ample evidence that in past centuries, sculptural traditions have existed in areas nowadays inhabited by peoples who do not produce masks and have no idea about what the masks meant, or the mask meant to the people who before them inhabited the areas. Within these three broadly defined regions of the Western Sudan, the Guinea Coast, and the Congo, there are some groups, you should keep that in mind, which do not carve. There are others where there is a tremendous proliferation of carving of masks and statues, such as the Yoruba of Nigeria, or the Bapende or the Balega in the Congo. There are others still where masks are very casual and not too important as statues are. In general, one can say about this distribution of sculpture in Africa that Islam, the desert, and pastoralism have been unfavorable towards the plastic arts, as have been unfavorable towards them in more recent decades Christianity, colonial administration, and political movement, prophetic movements. Peoples with outstanding traditions of carving are to be found in the savanna area of these three regions, as well as in the forest milieus. Since the time Hardy wrote on African art, some have tended to think that African sculpture is more symbolic in the savanna and more realistic in the forest. You know what some of these ecological interpretations mean, and how vague such concepts, or the definition of such concepts as more symbolic or more realistic is. And there would be scores of examples that would immediately contradict this when you look at this art, which I think is highly symbolic, stylized, abstract almost. It's of course produced by forest-dwelling people. Now, among the peoples who in these three areas have been making masks and statues, you will find all shades of social and political organization. Some have politically highly integrated systems, others live in acephalous, chiefless societies. Some have patrilineal descent systems, others matrilineal, others bilineal, others bilateral. The whole gamut of possibilities is exhausted. Some of these peoples are essentially agriculturalists, but there are a few, particularly in the southern Congo area, where even if agriculture has been introduced, hunting is still the most important activity, if not for their subsistence, at least for their ritual life. So there is no possibility to establish an easy correlation between certain types of environment or certain types of social organization and presence or absence of masks and statues. But I think that it is certain that the distribution of carvings and masks, the distribution of masks and statues is closely connected in Africa with the distribution of puberty initiations, with the development of secret associations, with various degrees of institutionalization of the pedagogical system, with the development of strong cosmological systems, and with specific types of religious systems. Just to give you a few examples, among the Lega in the eastern Congo, all statues and masks, about which I will speak in some greater detail later on, are owned exclusively and restricted to the members of a secret association, Bwami. Among the Babembe, another group in Central Africa, all carvings are restricted to circumcision ceremonies and to the Alunga association, which is connected with the cult of an earth spirit. Among the Dogon, most of Mali, most of the art serves as a kind of graphic illustration or iconic illustration of cosmologies and myths. Or to further clarify the things I'm saying here, among the Kuba in Central Africa, close to Luluabur, the Kuba being one of the greatest, having one of the greatest cultural traditions of Africa. Among those Kuba, statues, which are often said to be portraits of the divine kings Nim, are carved. Never are there any carvings made to commemorate dead commoners or chiefs of lower rank than the paramounts. Now these Kuba, who carve these memorial statues for their divine kings, have no ancestral cult, but they have very strong ideas and beliefs about the dead and about particularly the reincarnation of the dead. All individuals among these Kuba are involved in a cycle of metempsychosis, which is as follows. When an individual dies, the invisible part of him, Ipil, goes to a subterranean village called Ilwen, where it continues to live in human form very much the way it lived in its village on Earth, and it is used to regularly visit the terrestrial villages. Then one day the Ipil, the invisible part of man, dies in that subterranean village, in that first heaven, if you like so, and moves to a distant world called Mbongo, from where it will later be reborn in the form of an animal to be finally reborn again in a human being, not necessarily in the same clan to which it originally belonged. And this cycle is perpetuated, according to their thinking, is perpetuated, so that this belief about metempsychosis gives almost to ordinary beings the character of being immortal. The only person who escapes this cycle is the divine king, the Nim. He is always perpetuated in other human beings, namely in the next following successor. And to stress this idea of perennity of the divine kingship, the carvings have been made. So I mean that when we look for the reasons why certain types of masks or statues have been carved among certain groups with certain meanings and not in others, we'll have to dig deeply into the metaphysical and cosmological conceptions of some of these people, and not merely look for loose correlations between types of social organization, for instance, or environment and distribution of art. Right. It is also often said that African art is tribal, and you'll read that everywhere. The word tribe, as you all know perhaps, or should know, is a catchword which has served in most studies to hide away our ignorance about African subdivisions and African culture. It has been used to cover a wide range of different entities, ranging from politically integrated groups or nations with ethnically heterogeneous populations, to linguistic units, to politically non-integrated groups. It incorporates nicknames. Everything has been covered by the concept tribe, which I say is so very much used when we speak about Africa. For the study of the styles and the meanings of the sculptures, I think that this widely used concept tribe is useless and misleading, except if the necessary ethnographical studies have in each particular case clearly defined and circumscribed the concept. Now, in some well-documented cases, it is clear that the use of a particular group of statues or of a particular stylistic group of masks is not restricted to the tribe, but has its extensions among many neighboring groups. Thus the Bapende who make these masks here, or the Bapende masks rather, are represented not merely among representatives of the Bapende tribe, but among many neighboring groups who have their own tribal names, such as the Bapinji, the Bahum, the Baholo, and many others. And that's the case also for many areas in Africa. The tribe itself, if it is adequately defined, is never rigidly homogeneous. It is never an homogeneous or uniform unit. It is internally segmented. There is much local specialization in rituals or in distribution of certain cultural features. Thus, for instance, this mask, people referring to the mask in textbooks will say that this is a mask of Babembe style, the Babembe being located somewhere here on the shores of Lake Tanganyika. It has no meaning since the Babembe are 65,000, but not more than 5,000 Babembe use masks of this type, since the mask is associated with the distribution of a particular secret association that acts as an agent of social control in the southernmost group of them, but it is further distributed, that association, among groups which have almost no connections with the Babembe, among groups, I mean, which tribally are different, such as the Babuyu or the Basikasingo. So you don't speak about the Babembe being a tribe culture, but rather about the culture of the Alunga Association as distributed among the Babembe tribe, the Babuyu tribe, and parts of the Basikasingo tribe. That gives a totally different perspective, I think, on the situation of African art. So, most oftenly, I would say, we are dealing not really with a tribal art, but with art produced for an association, art produced for a particular chief, art of a chiefdom, art of a cult group, art of a village, art of a circumcision lodge, and of course art of a particular artist or school of artists who have too much and too often been neglected in studies on African sculpture. Finally, it is said that African art is functional. A sculpture has, of course, or a mask, be it a mask or a statue, has always something to say. It has something to do. It is composed in a given social setting, and it has a cultural content. It expresses for the people who make it a special understanding of the world, of society, of man, and it very often indicates a close unity between all that. It is always very difficult to determine to what extent there exists in Africa art for art's sake, particularly when we deal with masks and statues. Is a doll merely a doll? The Bapende say that one category of their masks, these famous Mbuya masks, are merely, as they say, gimagyasaga, things of play, things which have not to be taken seriously, which are, in other words, not sacred. But these masks, which they call things of play, can never be seen by non-initiates except in a dance. They can never be touched except by initiates. When people are severely ill in the village, the mask acts as a curing agent, and so on and so on. People have to carve little masks in ivory, particularly the wives of carvers of the Mbuya, to protect themselves against the inherent force that is discharged by the mask carved by the husband, and so on. So it's a very relative concept to say these are just things of play. Generally speaking, I would say, when we have been discussing the function of African art, there has been too much emphasis on the religious. Religious conceived in terms of ancestral cult, of worship of particular divinities, of fertility principles, of twin cult, of hunting magic, or of destructive magic of all kinds. In fact, there are a great many different usages, many non-religious, to which this art has been put. Masks, for instance, it is widely known, and I refer to that fact when I showed you that bigger mask there. Masks may act as agents of social control. As among the Igala of Nigeria, masks used to be arbiters entering into the field of murder cases, cases of theft, cases of indebtedness, and so on. Masks may also, as among those people here of the Congo, the Balega, be essentially didactic devices. They are not representations of ancestors, they are not fetishes, they are not portraits of that man, they are didactic devices, as I will explain you if there is enough time left. So, as a matter of fact, next to the religious, I would even say that in very many cases, the didactic value of masks and statues is extremely great in Africa. In order to explain that a little bit more precisely, I want to say a few words about an art which I have been collecting myself among the people where I did some field work 10 years ago. The Balega, who lived in the forest regions here west of Lake Tanganyika, about 300,000 people altogether. Oh, that's the definite drama. I'll hang myself this time. Well, some of the force of one of the masks is working against me now, I believe, you know. Who knows in what conditions I have acquired them, you see, that has to be found out. So anyway, these Balega carve masks and statues in the first place. Masks in wood or in ivory. They may be much larger. I have personally collected an ivory mask of this size, which is a unique piece. I mean, there are all kinds of sizes. They make them in wood, bone, or ivory. They carve masks, statues in ivory, like these, or in wood, like this one, or they may also make them in resin or in soapstone. There's a great variety of materials used by them. Now, all those carvings, statues and masks, plus animal figures, plus hammers, which very much look like a phallus, plus beautiful spoons in ivory or bone, plus axe blades in elephant bone, and so on and so on. All these things, all these carvings, I would say, not merely masks and statues, are exclusively owned by the members of a secret association, a graded association, which includes men and their wives. Not all their wives, some of them. They can select them. Now, the initiations into this association are an extremely complex and elaborate matter taking years and years of preparation. The initiations into the lower grades, there are about 7 lower grades, a hierarchy of them, follow the lines of the segmentary lineage structure of these people. It's an involved matter of social anthropology, whereas the initiations into the upper grade of the association are held within the range of ritual communities composed by different clans, 3 or 4, who are linked together for their initiations, or by different lineages of different clans. Now, this art, first of all, is not tribal, as I pointed out, in this sense that some Balega have never made carvings in ivory, but only in wood, and vice versa. they are not tribal in this sense that they are restricted to the members of that secret association. Other people cannot buy them or have them produced for them or possess them. They are not tribal in that certain groups in contact with the Balega on the borderlines of the North and the East have also developed a stylistically very similar type of sculptures. Now, all these pieces in ivory or wood, anything, are part of what they call Masengo, M-A-S-E-N-G-O. As are part of Masengo these polished shells, mussel shells, or these scales of the giant anteater, pangolin, or these tusks of the Hiloshera, what is that? No, the wild boar, the huge wild boar, Hiloshera, I mean it's called, or these teeth of the Dendrohyrax or lava rat. They are all part of the same thing. They are Masengo, or this little ivory tusk, and many other things, or this shield here of an Izezekumbe turtle. All that is the same thing. There is no distinction made in terminology, I would say in verbal behavior, between these carvings and these other anonymous, obscure pieces, which of course art dealers and private collectors never want in their windows. Now, some of these Masengo, be it statues or these obscure things, are owned and possessed individually. That means by initiates of the appropriate grade, of course, since each type is connected with a specific grade. And these individually owned objects are inherited according to an elaborate process of not merely inheritance, but also substitutions in the grade. Others of these pieces are held in the name of a ritual community or of a kinship grouping by the most senior member in the grade, for instance. Still others, like this statue, are never individually held, but are always part of a, is that long enough? Okay. Are part of a basket which you see here carried by one of these initiates, and which may contain a variety of objects. I have only part here of them on my photograph, which may be wooden carvings, highly stylized reproductions of birds' beaks, but it may also include some of these anonymous objects like scales of a giant anteater, teeth and parts of tusks, and so on and so on. At this stage, what do these pieces mean for the people? They are emblems, in the very first place, emblems of rank. They are indicators of seniority, of social position, and they are, of course, also factors of social cohesion, since the fundamental unity of a kinship grouping or of a ritual community is expressed by the possession by that group of one such basket with the collective initiatory objects. But the statues are more than emblems, more than symbols of status and rank, of seniority and so on. They have many other functions, and they are, since they are, I would say, initiatory objects, they have essentially a didactic meaning. The statues have something to say. The statues, in other words, are associated with proverbs that contain teachings about the ethical ideals held and philosophical ideals held by the members of the association. Now, the full meaning conveyed by each of these statues or masks can be understood, as I pointed out already for this earlier mask, only in the full configuration of ceremonies. This statue here, for instance, which is part of a basket of initiatory objects, represents Miss or Mrs., let's say Mrs. Wayenda, the woman, wife of an initiate, who during her pregnancy has had intercourse with another man. That is not normal adultery. That's extremely dangerous type of adultery for various reasons, since this is mixing the sperm, which leads to destruction of the persons in their opinion. So that is the idea contained in this statute, and wherever you find these ugly looking rudimentary sculptured figures of females, they will always represent Mrs. Wayenda. However, the full meaning of the piece becomes clear only when you see it used in its context, since, as I showed you on the photograph, a great number of other statues of different stylistic aspect, I would say of different morphology, may be shown at the same time that this piece is exhibited to the initiate, and there may be skulls of little monkeys or of chimpanzees connected with all that too. Now, in the rite where Mrs. Wayenda occurs, the members of the association essentially try to say two things, and they contrast these two things by two different sets of statues, masks, and other objects. First, it is good to be a member of the association. Prosperity, wealth, bousogam, kalokagatia, as the Greeks would call that. How do you translate that in English? I don't know whether there is such a concept in the English language. I mean, to be morally and physically beautiful and good is expressed by one set of statues, one of the statues being this, the man with two heads, he may have four, it doesn't matter, who represents precisely the initiate who has knowledge greater than any other person can have, who sees and knows more than any others. And on the other hand, there are the forces of destruction, as expressed by the statues of, for instance, Mrs. Wayenda, by the statue of Katanda, who is said to be the warmonger, by the mask of Kabamba, who is said to be a little old quarrelsome man who went always to fight with others and finally got killed. These two antagonistic forces, you see, destruction on the one hand, greatness as achieved in the context of an association, are expressed by these pieces. And they have many other meanings. The meaning is not simple. Some of them then, they always rub them with oil and perfume them. They perfume their pieces. Some of them then may, for instance, be delicately rubbed, and the powder will be drunk as a potion, protective potion, by the owner of the piece. That means that the piece has intrinsically force to discharge and gives prosperity and health to its possessor through communication with it, through communion with it. Some of the pieces, like these, as an additional function to the ones I mentioned, didactic and emblems and so on, are what we could call amulets, but of a very special type. These ones, for instance, are carried by women of the upper rank on their belts to express their masculinity. These females, when they have achieved the summum, I would say, of knowledge through the initiations, are identified with males and have all the privileges that males exercise in this society, including also that they cannot be divorced, that they cannot be remarried, that they are perpetually attached to the person of their husband. And the same things then, which are, I would say, almost phallic symbols for initiated females, can also be attached around the neck of a goat or around a little stool in order to protect it in joking relationships against the sororal nephews who have the right to take these things away, except if there is such a protective device around them. And many, many other meanings. The statues, as a matter of fact, and particularly the masks, are often called ketumba or lukungu, skull or corpse or body. And as a matter of fact, some of these pieces, when the owner of them dies, are exposed on his grave until the body through decomposition is decapitated. The head is left. I will not describe that ritual. It's too impressive, I believe. We better forget it. But in any way, it's believed that at that very moment of natural decapitation, I would say, the spirit, the ipil, enters into the mask. And later on, when the son or a junior brother or a nephew of the owner of the statue is initiated, they'll say, that is your father or senior brother. You see, they are really considered to be a kind of graphic or iconic expressions of the perennity and the immortality of the Bami. And in the rites, in some of the rites where they are used, they will be referred to as Bele Muno, those who are among us, those being the statues who really embody the dead honors. It's a very complex matter, I suppose. I wished I had more time to enlarge a little bit further upon that, but I simply wanted to introduce this, what would I say, this little note to convince you, perhaps, if that was necessary, that the art is not, is multivalent in its meanings. There is not one simple thing to be said about them, a fetish or the representation of an ancestor or this or that. It's much more complex, of course, as you probably will have felt now on. Now let me come to some final remarks. Various examples, I believe, which I have been giving here are sufficient, at least I hope so, to give you an idea of the complex setting in which these things occur, the very unique, original configuration in which they are used and from which they derive their meanings. Now, in modern Africa, because we are compelled to come back to modern Africa since this lecture is part of the building of nations, in modern Africa, the elite groups, and to some extent the masses, have developed many new concepts about the self. There are the new ideologies, such as negritude or eclecticism or Pan-Africanism. There are the new political and cultural problems, such as nation building. There are new types of institutions, such as schools or courts or communes, new roles and new roles and statuses for men and women, greater social and physical mobility. All that is new in Africa. Some of these new ideologies now, like negritude or eclecticism or Pan-Africanism, have been extremely powerful agents in the achievement of political independence, in the recapturing of a renewed pride in the cultural past of Africa, in the search for typically African models and values. Now, the question is, to what extent can the traditional African arts contribute to forging a unity, to develop a closer system of intercommunication between the elites and the rural masses in Africa, or to consolidate the position of the new political leaders? It is assumed by many that there is a basic African unity reflected in the arts. This is a point that has to be validated through a tremendous research task that awaits us all, since, as I have been explaining here, there has been often much loose talk about common values and patterns in the arts, as if we knew everything about them and we know nothing almost. Biebuyck of the British Museum, who in my opinion is the outstanding authority on African plastic art, has repeatedly said and written, with reference to African sculpture, that there is no African art, speaking about sculpture, nor indeed Nigerian or Congolese art, but that there is Yoruba art or Igbo art or Pende art or Lega art. He is a little bit there different in emphasis. He still believes very much in tribes. And that these have hardly more in common, that these various tribal arts, as he calls them, have hardly more in common with each other than with art of the Sepik in New Guinea. There is some reason to believe him, although further analysis would be necessary. Hugh Tracy, an author, a well-known authority, I would say, on African music, has written that African folk music is diverse and that it cannot be properly represented by the compositions of a single group or of a single country, but rather by the musics of a great number of loosely related tribes. Possibly there might be some greater unity in the field of oral literature, although the tremendous linguistic diversity in Africa acts here as an impediment, but Herskovits has rightly pointed out that if we are ever to be able to grasp the unities in that African oral art and take advantage of the insights they yield, we are going to need far better data than we have at present. And if ever, I add, some unity can be validly established by the elites, the masses of Africa will have to be trained in seeing and understanding that unity. For I, for one, I've lived some 11 years in Africa, don't think that at present a rural Bambara of Mali cares even about the superficial meanings of some of these statues I have been displaying here tonight, and that indeed he would treat them as evil things. Now the elites too will have to give better patronage to the traditional arts of Africa, since there has been much speculation and even, I dare say, some ambivalence in their attitude. And never should it be forgotten that much of this African art is perhaps beyond the horizon of the African elite as much as it is beyond the horizon of the Westerner, since these arts, as I have slightly tried to explain to you, are deeply steeped in a climate of which they often, as we too, have not had the experience. Finally, as I said before, much of the arts are embedded in a highly original socio-political, ritual, or educational contexts. Some of these contexts, it is clear, will not survive, and some have indeed ceased to function or have been eroded by the heavy blows dealt by the missionaries, Islam, colonial administration, prophetic movements. And how far then will it be possible, or I would say, will there be time to meld together the many different artistic traditions into a new synthesis that would serve as a binding force? The answer seems very hazardous, but I would like to quote Soyinka, the well-known Nigerian playwright, who said recently that the African writers have the feeling that it is their duty to preserve the elements of philosophy and ethics of traditional African society, but that the pace at which Africa is going right now is such that lots of writers feel themselves out of sympathy with these essential cultures of Africans. They have the feeling, and Soyinka thinks with some justification, that there really is no place for this in the contemporary experience of the African. Thank you.